Next, I want to talk about economic geography in the realm. And just a, this isn't really testable stuff. I just want to mention this concept of the Asian century. There is a growing sense that Asia is going to be the world leader economically in the 21st century, that they have a lot of things going for them. They have a large workforce because of their large populations. And they also have history on their side, that they have a long history of influence in the world. And so before the Industrial Revolution, these were the wealthiest parts of the world. And recent economic growth, rapid economic growth in this realm looks to sort of put them back in that standing of being the largest economies in the world over time. So even as now that two of the three largest economies in the world are in East Asia. That includes China and Japan, and the US is the third. So US is the top economy. China is just behind us and catching up, and Japan is somewhat behind that, but still one of the largest three economies in the world. However, there's still disparities between rich and poor in this part of the world, and a growing gap between the very wealthy and those that are not wealthy. Now, let's stop and let's kind of rewind and kind of see, well, how did this come about? Because the whole region did not develop economically all in one shot. First was Japan. And Japan, if you remember your history, was one of the combatants in World War II, but after losing the war, received some economic development from the United States, similar to the Marshall Plan that we discussed in Western Europe. So there was a sense that Japan was a necessary ally to combat against the threat of expansion from the Soviet Union, similar to what we saw in Europe. And with that support and with its own, Japan had been a thriving industrial power in the past, but most of it had been directed towards its military and military expansion. With the end of World War II, with Japan no longer being a big military power, a lot of that industrial technology was focused on its export economy in a time called the Japanese Miracle. And so during this time after World War II, Japan became an economic superpower. So by the 1960s, Japan was the first leader in economic development in East Asia. And they became a leader. I'm going to do actually a quick correction there. And what's called high value added manufacturing. In other words, high-end goods like a Toyota, for example, or a television. Okay, following in the path of Japan were the Asian tigers. So from the 1960s up to the 1990s, you had the growth of these separate areas. These are strong, industrialized, export-oriented economies, similar to how Japan developed, but they do not include Japan. Japan was first. These four tigers came after that. They include South Korea. It's where Samsung, that type of thing is made. They include Taiwan, a lot of electronic components that you may not know the brand of that are included in your computers and other devices, developed in Taiwan. Hong Kong, which we've discussed, that's now a special SAR of China. And then one outside of the realm that we'll discuss in the future called Singapore, which is centrally located along trade routes. And there's even new countries that are starting to follow in these tigers' path, especially in Southeast Asia. We'll talk more about those in the future. Okay, so following along the tigers, you have the growth of China as an economic powerhouse. But it doesn't start everywhere. The government sets up these special places called SEZs, or special economic zones. These have government incentives to attract foreign investment. So near Shanghai, this is called the Podong SEZ. This is that area along the end of the Zhangjiang River. And this is another one we'll talk about, Shenzhen. This is a powerhouse of an economic development area near Hong Kong. So there's some other ones, Hainan near Southeast Asia, Benai in the north, but these are places where economic development was encouraged by the Chinese government and that gained connections to the outside world initially. One best example of this is the Shenzhen SEZ. It's at the end of the Pearl River estuary like Hong Kong. So here we have Hong Kong. Remember, Hong Kong was one of the four tigers. And as China began to develop its neighboring area, which was only like a little fishing village until not too long ago, became the fastest growing city in human history. Shenzhen is now like New York City, and that's only since the 1990s. So this Pearl River estuary, even though it's not maybe so big as a river, but this area at the end of the river is the most productive economies of the world of its size. So about half of Chinese exports come from this area of Shenzhen and Hong Kong. For example, iPhones, that sort of thing. This is sort of one of the high-tech areas where things like that are made. So just to recap the economic growth, you had Japan, World War II, the 1960s initially, followed by the Asian tigers, 1960s, 1990s, followed by China, starting with the special economic zones and their connections with the tigers in Japan, and then slowly kind of expanding into other parts of China. Now, one other related item is that this massive growth of the Chinese economy has led to a lot of rural to urban migration, where there are so many jobs in these SEZs and other urban areas that it's attracting a lot of people who live in the countryside and don't make very much money. So fairly recently, China, unlike India, now has a mostly urban population. So this shows in the 1940s, 90% lived in the rural environment in the country and 10% in the city. That's now recently just flipped to just over half of the Chinese live in cities and just under half live in the rural environment. The rural to urban migration is a bit more managed in China due to a permit system called the Hoku system that determines where you can live, that you actually need special permits to move to the city permanently, but they also have what's called a floating population, sort of like how people would, when the US-Mexico border was more fluid, people would move in, work seasonally, and move back out. But you have this internally in China where you have temporary workers that come into cities, make some money, and then go back home. One other thing I want to highlight, that China is not just a couple of cities, but it has over 170 cities of over a million people that are twice as big as Fresno, in other words. There's only about 50 cities in the US of that size, just for comparison. So again, massive urbanization in China. So this is showing the urban population really scattered about, especially in these SEZs, but also expanding into the interior as well. This is Shenzhen. Here's a view of Shenzhen here, a brand new urban area, super rapid growth. However, the economic growth is not all the way even. That around places like, this is called the Guangdong province, which includes Shenzhen and Hong Kong, massive economic growth and massive amount of wealth. Whereas if you get really far into the interior, it's very low. And one last thing that I'll lump in with the economic geography is natural resources. That China does have natural resources such as coal and oil, but because of its huge population and thriving economy, it doesn't have enough to fulfill its needs. And so China is the largest consumer of raw material and energy.